December 16th. That's when the November jobs report will finally be released. 6 days after the Federal Reserve meets to decide on rate cuts. The most critical piece of economic data, the labor market report that Powell needs to justify cutting rates, won't exist until after the decision is made. Think about that for a second. The October jobs report was completely canceled. The Bureau of Labor Statistics announced on November 19th that the household survey data is not able to be retroactively collected. It's gone forever. The September jobs report, which showed 119,000 jobs added and unemployment at 4.4%, was delayed by 7 weeks and only released on November 20th. And the November report, originally scheduled for December 5th, has been pushed to December 16th, 6 days after the Fed meeting. The Fed is flying blind. Zero October data, stale September data, and November data that won't arrive until after they vote. Wall Street economists are calling this unprecedented. LinkedIn analyst Michael Keene wrote, "The Fed will walk into the December 9th to 10th meeting using labor data from early fall to make a choice that shapes 2026 and 2027. This isn't monetary policy, it's guesswork. But here, they are telling you, the government shutdown that caused this data blackout wasn't an accident. It lasted 43 days, from October 1st to November 12th, the longest shutdown in U.S. history, and the timing was perfect to blind the Fed right before the most critical rate decision of the year. The mechanism behind this data blackout reveals why December 10th isn't the rate cut. It's a gamble. And when you're making trillion-dollar monetary policy decisions based on 2-month-old data, the odds of catastrophic error approach 100%. Let's start with what actually happened, because the timeline of this data blackout is too convenient to be coincidence. On October 1st, 2025, the U.S. government shut down after Congress failed to pass a funding bill. All non-essential federal operations ceased. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which produces the monthly jobs report, furloughed its staff. Data collection stopped immediately. The October jobs report requires 2 surveys conducted in the middle of the month. First, the household survey, where 60,000 households are contacted to determine employment status. This survey produces the unemployment rate. Second, the establishment survey, where 145,000 businesses are surveyed about their payrolls. This survey produces the non-farm payrolls number. The household survey must be conducted during the survey week, which is the week containing the 12th of the month. If you miss that week, the data is lost forever. You can't retroactively call people weeks later and ask them what their employment status was on October 12th. They won't remember accurately. The data would be worthless. The establishment survey can be collected later because businesses keep records. You can call a company in December and ask about their October payroll. But the household survey is time-sensitive, and the government shutdown meant the BLS couldn't conduct it. On November 12th, the government reopened after Trump signed a Republican funding bill, 43 days. The longest shutdown in history. And by the time operations resumed, it was too late to save the October data. On November 19th, the BLS officially announced there will be no employment situation report for October. The household survey data is not able to be retroactively collected. October establishment survey data will be included with the November data, but there will be no October unemployment rate. It's gone. Then they announced the November report, originally scheduled for December 5th, would be delayed to December 16th. Why? Because the shutdown disrupted November's data collection too. The BLS needed extra processing time to ensure accuracy. But the chart I'm about to show you reveals why this delay is catastrophic for the Fed. Because the Fed meets on December 9th and 10th, and the November jobs report won't be released until December 16th. The Fed must decide on rate cuts with zero current labor market data. Here's what the Fed has access to. September jobs report released on November 20th after a 7-week delay. Here's what the Fed doesn't have. October jobs report canceled. No unemployment rate. No household survey. Just establishment survey data that will be lumped into the November release. November jobs report delayed until December 16th, 6 days after the Fed meeting. So Powell and the FOMC will walk into the December 9th to 10th meeting with September labor market data and nothing else. They're supposed to decide whether to cut rates for the 3rd consecutive time based on information that's 3 months old. Markets are pricing in an 87% probability of a 25 basis point rate cut on December 10th, bringing the Fed funds rate to 3.5 to 3.75%. But that's based on the assumption that the labor market is weakening and needs support. How do we know the labor market is weakening if we have no current data? Private sector data is filling the void, but it's contradictory. ADP, a payroll processing company, reported that private employers shed 32,000 jobs in November. That sounds terrible. Cut rates immediately. But Indeed's job postings index shows hiring demand cooling but not collapsing. Challenger Gray and Christmas reported planned layoffs rising but not spiking. Revelio Labs data shows a different picture entirely. The private data is all over the place. Corey Stahel, senior economist at Indeed, said, "Despite the wealth of private job data, the absence of critical government statistics generates further uncertainty for Fed officials. Reliable federal data, particularly regarding price levels and inflation, is challenging to replicate, and there are no perfect alternatives." Translation: the Fed is guessing. And guessing with trillion-dollar consequences. Now let's talk about the inflation blackout. Because it's not just jobs data that's missing. The October CPI report was also canceled. On November 21st, the BLS announced that it was nixing a standalone release of the October inflation report since it was unable to collect the data in real time. The Consumer Price Index requires surveys conducted throughout the month at specific retailers. If those surveys don't happen on schedule, the data can't be accurately reconstructed. So the Fed has no October inflation data either. The last CPI report they have is from September, which showed headline inflation at 2.4% and core inflation at 3.3%. But that's 3 months old. What's inflation doing now? Nobody knows. The November CPI report, which would normally be released in early December before the Fed meeting, has been delayed to December 18th, 8 days after the Fed votes. So the Fed will decide on rate cuts without knowing whether inflation is accelerating, decelerating, or holding steady. Fed officials are divided on what to do. Some, like Chicago Fed President Austan Goolsbee, are cautious. He said on CNBC, "I am somewhat hesitant about implementing too many rate cuts too soon, relying on inflation to diminish on its own." Others, like Fed Governor Steven Mnuchin, are aggressive. He's advocated for 5 additional cuts, including large reductions at the next meeting. But they're all flying blind. No October jobs data. No October inflation data. Delayed November data. The Fed is making the most important monetary policy decision of 2025 with the worst information blackout in modern history. But here's the death spiral scenario. The Fed cuts rates on December 10th based on stale September data showing unemployment at 4.4% and inflation at 2.4%. Markets rally. Stocks hit new highs. Everyone celebrates. Then, on December 16th, the November jobs report is released. And it shows the labor market is much stronger than September suggested. Payrolls surged 250,000 in November. Unemployment dropped back to 4.2%. The SAM rule was a false positive caused by immigration expanding the labor force, not actual job losses. The Fed just cut rates based on weak September data. But the November data shows the economy doesn't need rate cuts. The Fed made a mistake. Markets realize Powell cut too aggressively. Inflation expectations rise. Bond yields spike. The 10-year Treasury hits 4.5%. Stocks crash as investors realize the Fed is behind the curve again, just like 2021 when they called inflation transitory. Alternatively, the November jobs report shows the labor market collapsed. Payrolls fell 50,000. Unemployment spiked to 4.7%. Layoffs accelerated. The Fed cut rates on December 10th, but it was too little, too late. The recession is already here. The Fed needed to cut 50 basis points, not 25, they're behind again. Markets crash because the Fed can't stop the recession. Either way, the Fed loses. Because they're making decisions blind. If the data comes in stronger than expected, they cut too much and fuel inflation. If the data comes in weaker than expected, they cut too little and fail to prevent recession. There's no scenario where flying blind produces the correct policy. So here's the brutal math. December 10th, 2025, the Fed meets. They have September jobs data showing 119,000 jobs added and 4.4% unemployment. That's 90 days old. They have September CPI data showing 2.4% inflation. That's 90 days old. October jobs report, canceled. October CPI, canceled. November jobs report, delayed until December 16th, 6 days after the vote. November CPI, delayed until December 18th, 8 days after the vote. Markets pricing an 87% probability of a rate cut. But the Fed has no idea what the labor market or inflation is doing right now. Private sector data is contradictory. ADP shows 32,000 job losses. Indeed shows cooling but not collapse. Challenger shows rising layoffs. Revelio shows something different. Nobody agrees. The government shutdown lasted 43 days, October 1st to November 12th, the longest in U.S. history, and it blinded the Fed right before the most critical rate decision of the year. Wall Street is calling this flying blind into a recession. LinkedIn analysts say this isn't monetary policy, it's guesswork. Are you watching the show, or are you positioned for the Fed's blind gamble on December 10th? What do you think? Drop your answer in the comments below.